A warm welcome, dear viewers, to the 9th and very special episode of our series, Philosophy of Systems. It is a pleasure to have you with us today as we continue our exploration. Recently, we've mainly been discussing social and socio-political issues in this context. Today, I'd like to briefly recap for you and also for those who are joining us for the first time what this is all about, what the problem actually is. It's about the following. We talk about the individual and society. And we say that society is a system, namely a system of individuals. Here we are primarily talking about the society organized according to legal norms, in other words, the state. So in our context, we can identify society with the state and use the terms synonymously, and then the citizens of the state are us, that is, individuals. State. So we use the terms individual, society, and citizens, state synonymously. That might be more familiar to you because if I say society is a problem, you understand it better if you imagine the state is a problem for me, who wants my money and so on, demands things from. All right, these two levels. Individuals and society, citizens and state, are system levels. The individuals make up society. That is to say, in other words, the members of the community or the citizens together make up the state. No individuals, no society, obviously, but society itself is also important for individuals. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. And you could even go so far as to say that in our existence as individuals, without the social organization we call the state, we would have some difficulties. Now, unfortunately, there is a problem between hierarchically ordered systems, as is the case here, state, citizens, or society, individuals. I'll stick with this more general formulation. In such hierarchically ordered systems, there is a boundary. We have called it the system boundary in the narrower sense. This does not refer to the external boundary, but rather to the boundary between the two levels, the state above, the citizen below, society above, the individual below. The above and below is not really a qualitative distinction, but it is still a problem. This boundary, since both are so closely intertwined, it's clear. Individuals, we humans, make up society. That's a close interconnection. So this boundary is not as sharp and clear as we are used to with boundaries. That means we tend to overlook this boundary between the two system levels, individuals and society. That is a problem. Additionally, let's say for further clarification that any logical conclusions or inferences drawn at the level of individuals or single persons cannot be directly or simply transposed, transferred, or applied onto broader societal problems, issues, or challenges without the necessary translation processes or interpretive steps being involved, and vice versa. A translation effect is necessary here. And that too is difficult. And we struggle with this difficulty. We do not recognize this boundary well. We tend to level both levels, simply overlook them, and consider it all to be the same thing. And we have difficulties transposing logical conclusions from one level to the other. And this also applies to morality. And in that context, it even plays a particularly important role. That is why, starting today, we want to discuss a few questions about the problems of individual ethics versus societal ethics. So, the individual level, individual moral concepts, and the corresponding rights and requirements of society, which also have ethical dimensions. Individual ethics versus societal ethics. It all sounds incredibly theoretical, but now we'll make it very practical. There is a huge problem between these two moral concepts. And I thought the best and most striking way to illustrate this problem is with the play you might know by Ferdinand von Schirach, Terror. Ferdinand von Schirach is a lawyer, was a criminal defense attorney for a long time, so he knows his way around legal matters. This is a play with a legal and judicial focus. What is it about? Very briefly. A long play presented very briefly. It deals with a very current and, unfortunately, modern topic. A Lufthansa commercial airliner is hijacked by a terrorist during a domestic flight in Germany. Besides the terrorist, there are 164 people on board this plane. The story at its core is simple to tell. A Bundeswehr escort jet takes off. The pilot is Major Lars Koch. So he is escorting this plane. And this plane, this hijacked aircraft with 164 people on board, is intended by the terrorist, this is his plan, to be flown into the Arena Stadium in Munich, where 70,000 people are currently gathered for an event. That means, for clarity, it's about Lars Koch considering, what should I do now? Is there any way I can prevent this disaster with thousands of expected deaths and injuries? Of course, he can do that by shooting down the plane. And that's what he does, although it should be noted that he does not have an order to do so. He is explicitly forbidden to do so. It is prohibited by law. He does it as a matter of conscience. He kills 164 innocent people, including the terrorist, with the intention of saving thousands of others. He takes responsibility. And here is exactly where the problem lies. As mentioned, it is prohibited by law. He acts against the law. He goes to court. And he goes to court charged with 164 counts of murder. He killed 165 people, but here it is about 164 innocent people. This is a very fascinating discussion, which is described in the form of a court trial by Ferdinand von Schirach. And Mr. Schirach does something else as well. The author Schirach does something else as well. After the closing arguments have been made, and after presenting the entire story in detail, he stops the play and allows the audience to vote. They are asked to consider whether they believe Lars Koch, the major who shot down the passenger plane, should be convicted of 164 counts of murder, or whether he should be acquitted. That is the dilemma. Now, that is a basic summary of this play. Of course, there are many more issues involved. What if, for example, Koch hadn't fired? Maybe the passengers on the plane would have overpowered the perpetrator before he could fly into the stadium. Maybe the stadium could have been evacuated, and so on and so forth. But let's stick to this comparison. The decision between 164 innocent people and thousands of innocent people. What do I do? And so Koch, following his conscience, decided against the law to shoot down the plane, and in this way ended up in court charged with murder. So what is the legal situation? A law on aviation security was established after a minor incident involving a confused private pilot somewhere in Frankfurt's banking district. The Aviation Security Act of 2005 explicitly permitted emergency shootdowns. So if it had remained valid, Lars Koch would have gone unpunished in this case. Then there was a constitutional complaint, and a year later, the law was amended by Parliament following a decision by the Constitutional Court. And from then on, emergency shootdowns were prohibited. So, unconstitutional. Why? You all know our basic law, or at least you know that it exists. And generally, whether we've read it or not, we all know about the first paragraph, section 1 of the basic law. Human dignity is inviolable. So this is the human dignity clause. It has a guarantee of eternity, as it's called. That means no parliament can change or vote on this clause, not even amend or abolish it, not even with a unanimous vote. Now, what is human dignity? Essentially, and I'll come back to this in more detail in the next episode, but just briefly here, It is essentially based on the philosophy of the well-known philosopher Immanuel Kant, who lived in Königsberg. The idea is this: it is we humans who create values. So it is we humans who also establish moral values. When we humans, through our autonomous, self-determined decisions, establish moral laws, then we ourselves, as the ones making these decisions, cannot be subject to them as mere objects. That means the things in our world have a value that we humans assign to them. But we ourselves, as humans, as autonomous individuals, have a value that cannot be calculated or traded off. Other values are relative. They have different prices and can be weighed against each other, but not the human being as a value in itself, as an end in itself. That's what Kant calls it. This means that this value is something absolute, and Kant therefore calls it dignity. So this does not refer to some kind of official dignity or title, but rather to this absolute, unquestionable value of the human being, with, of course, their life and physical integrity being of primary importance. This basic law was created in 1949 in the aftermath of the Third Reich, and it was out of this memory that it was so strictly modeled after Immanuel Kant. This was established. Human dignity, an inviolable value, a value that cannot be traded or offset. You could also say that no one may be instrumentalized or used as a mere means against their will for any other purposes. This means, above all, that a person's life must never be used for purposes other than their own, in any way whatsoever, unless that person gives their explicit consent to it. This makes it clear, human dignity is absolute. It always applies. It cannot be changed. Above all, it cannot be weighed against anything else. You cannot weigh one human life against another. Exactly. Or balance them against each other. Accordingly, the prosecution's closing argument and the conviction followed this principle. It's simply about the arguments that say life cannot be traded off against life. Article 1 of the Basic Law prevents this. Human dignity, human life, has no market value. It is absolute. It cannot be offset. The perpetrator's decision of conscience in this case is unreliable. He needs a principle, or rather, the state needs a principle by which it measures such decisions. And that is precisely the principle of human dignity. That is actually already the essential core of the prosecution's case. The defense argues differently. They say this is a case of supralegal necessity. The law is contradictory. On the one hand, it demands that no person be sacrificed, not a single one, that no one has the right to dispose over a human life. But on the other hand, it allows for the possibility that under certain circumstances, a great many people may die. And now it gets very interesting. As mentioned, the play is interrupted. The audience votes. Are they for acquittal or conviction? Conviction would correspond to the principle of human dignity in line with the Air Security Act as it was amended in 2006, and acquittal would mean Lars Koch acted correctly. In this case, he had to weigh his options. And what's very interesting is that for all the performances of this play in Central Europe, a statistic was compiled to see how many audience members voted for acquittal and how many voted for conviction for murder. And the astonishing result is that over 85% of the audience for this play vote for acquittal. In their opinion, Lars Koch is not a murderer. In their opinion, Lars Koch was right to weigh the lives of those 164 people against the 70,000 lives in the stadium and make his decision accordingly. In this sense, to prevent greater harm. To prevent more loss of life, more harm to life and physical integrity, that is an astonishing result, and it completely contradicts this article of the Basic Law on Human Dignity and the corresponding legal ruling of the Federal Constitutional Court. The public judges differently, so there is a huge contradiction here, and this is exactly the point I want to make. The individual right, the individual prohibition on killing is, I believe, indisputable for any of us who are sane and not criminals. None of us is allowed to kill another person. This applies without exception. And there are no specific conditions for this except for one exception, self-defense. We can't go into that now. But Lars Koch has a good argument against this. The defendant, Lars Koch, in court has a good argument against this. He says, what about military service, actually? Are soldiers murderers, as was once said in the 1980s, and the Constitutional Court allowed people to express this opinion? Are soldiers murderers? Because they do kill, and are even ordered to kill, and are even trained to kill people. And in doing so, they violate the prohibition on killing. So here we have this fundamental contradiction, again, between individual rights, the prohibition on killing, as stated in the fifth commandment of Christianity in the Bible, and the societal mandate to protect the state and society from attacks, for example, by sacrificing human lives. That is a contradiction, an insoluble contradiction. And Lars Koch, who is a soldier, so this the character in the play, Lars Koch, says, I quote, he says the following: airplane passengers are weapons in a terrorist war. The life of a soldier is also weighed against dangers to the community in war. The state consciously accepts human sacrifices. Yes, that's how it is. A complete contradiction to Article 1, Paragraph 1 of the Basic Law, if you read it the way we have presented it. Lars Koch says about this, I have sworn a soldier's oath. The soldier's oath is, I swear to loyally serve the Federal Republic of Germany and to bravely defend the rights and freedom of the German people. That means nothing other, says Lars Koch, than that the state weighs the life of a soldier against the dangers threatening the community. Here we have exactly this difference in levels: individual, society, citizen, state. On the individual level, there is an absolute prohibition on killing. On the societal level, there is not. And that's true even in our own state. Until recently, we had compulsory military service. It still exists. It has just been, so to speak, suspended, put out of effect. So there is a significant discrepancy, a noticeable contradiction. What conclusion should we draw from this play from our perspective, from our social science perspective, from our system science perspective? Perhaps we should preface this with one thing. With moral laws, for example, with the prohibition on killing, it is said that this is absolutely valid. There are no exceptions. There are superlegal states of emergency, there is self-defense, there are all sorts of things, but there are no exceptions to this. That is true, but it's only half the truth. And I'd like to briefly tell you a little example from the natural sciences. The law of gravity. How did that come about? There's a legend that says, about 250 years ago, an Englishman named Isaac Newton had an apple fall on his head. And as a result of this injury, he not only cursed, but since he was a clever mathematician, thinker, and physicist, he used this as the basis to discover the law of gravity, commonly known as the law of falling objects. This law of gravity is valid in the universe without any exception, everywhere and at all times, and of course on Earth. Apples simply fall to the ground. Now imagine you're sitting under an apple tree, comfortably in a rocking chair, and above you are apples, but they don't fall. They don't fall on your head. So are you a magician? Do you have magical powers that can suspend this law of falling objects? Probably not, unless you were a student at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. So it's not the case that even a universally valid law, a law of nature in this case, isn't subject to certain conditions. And that's why, under different conditions, it can operate differently or not at all. Everyone immediately understands this, but these limitations must also be applied to moral laws, to ethical rules and ethical norms, even though they are universally valid. Now let's look at the prohibition of killing on the individual level. Things look different on the societal level. How does that come about? Above all, it comes about through what we have already thoroughly discussed. In the context of migration, the migration problem, the problem of large numbers. For example, in the case of asylum law, in issues of immigration. The problem of large numbers is that quantity turns into quality. That means when a problem that actually originates from individual rights, in this case from an ethical individual norm, becomes relevant within a societal framework, one that encompasses many, many people and affects a great number of individuals, then quantity turns into quality. That is, something of value emerges, which of course is again subject to ethical considerations and which has an intrinsic value on this different societal level. A classic and well-known example of this phenomenon is that drawing broad or general conclusions from the individual level to the societal level, or from the level of the individual citizen to the state, even in complex ethical and moral questions, is not possible without a careful and deliberate process of translation. This process is essential to ensure that the meaning and context are accurately conveyed and understood at each level. Is possible. And this in turn leads to the contradiction that exists between individual ethics. Keywords here include the concept of human dignity, as well as the strict prohibition of killing, and societal ethics, keyword. Military service, which is actually a really stark counterexample. There are several examples, but let's stick with this one for now. So now we've identified a problem between individual ethics and societal ethics that we actually can't solve. There is a very large number of ethical theories by renowned, clever, intelligent philosophers. Two of them are particularly prominent. One is the ethics of the already mentioned Immanuel Kant, with the principle of human dignity, to put it briefly, which is especially prevalent in Central Europe. The other is the so-called ethics of utility, or utilitarianism, which is mainly prominent in the Anglo-Saxon world. Utilitarianism is quite different. What is considered moral is what is demanded. That which brings about the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. A completely different principle. That's where we encounter the problem of large numbers. This ethic, which takes into account the number of people who experience a certain happiness, is therefore most applicable to the case of Lars Koch and the shooting down of the airplane. And now the question is, can both sides somehow be reconciled? It seems to be a complete contradiction. And both ethical systems have a huge influence. As mentioned, in the Anglo-Saxon world, utilitarianism prevails, you could say. And in Central Europe, especially in German-speaking countries, Kantian ethics is more prevalent. It's utilitarianism invented essentially by two gentlemen, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, two English philosophers who lived around the turn of the 17th to the 18th century. In the next episode, we will introduce these two ethical systems. We're going to give a short overview of these two ethical systems. Of course, this can only be done in a very brief outline form. You could give lectures on this for years. Thick books and entire libraries have been written about it. It's impossible to cover all of this in a half-hour session like this. But we can work out the principles, compare them with each other, and consider in what way this contradiction arises. So once again, Kantian ethics, human dignity principle. Individual ethics concerning individual people, and utilitarianism, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, more focused on large groups of people, that is, to be understood as social ethics. Of course, when it comes to the greatest happiness for the greatest number, you can again debate what constitutes the greatest happiness and what is meant by the greatest number. But it's clear that this also concerns human lives, since happiness obviously presupposes that one is alive and exists at all. And that one is physically unharmed and feels well is, of course, obvious. So next time, we will look at whether there are any points of contact between them. With that, I'll wrap up for today. Think about this play for a moment. Perhaps you've read it, maybe you've even seen it. And about this problem, which we will pick up again next time. That's all for today. Thank you very much for joining me. All the best to you. See you next time. Goodbye.